Hi, okay, so we're looking at chapter 5, the last part of chapter 5, specifically related to government intervention. So sometimes what happens is government will decide that we are going to implement a policy or strategy because we believe that the market mechanism is actually not sufficient, or it's not allocating or beneficial for consumers or the suppliers enough. So they then implement a strategy or a policy, and that will then influence what price and quantity is demanded within the market itself. So on first year economic level, we will only look at two. So it will be an introduction to what is actually done by governments. So the first one we will have a look at is maximum prices. We can also call it price ceiling. And the second one will be minimum prices or a price floor. So first question to you will be, okay, but what does maximum price mean? What does minimum price mean? So in effect, it means that we need to decide, is the price that government impose, is that going to be above or below equilibrium? So maximum price will always be below equilibrium. Let's use an example of bread. Bread, the current price of bread is 20 Rand, but government decides that's too high. As a staple food within the country, we want to ensure people can afford it, so we're going to set a maximum price of 10 Rand. So the maximum price is then below equilibrium. A minimum price, just the opposite, that will always be above equilibrium price. So that is generally there to make sure that producers are actually will benefit from it. So another example, agricultural products, let's say maize. The maize equilibrium price and quantity for maize is too low according to government and strategies that they want to impose. So they decide, let's say the maize price is currently at 2,000. They want to then set it at 3,500. So that's going to be above equilibrium. Okay, so a maximum price is always below equilibrium, and then a minimum price or a price floor will be above equilibrium. Subsidies and taxes, we will not do that this year. We will look at that in our second year economics. Okay, so as an example, this is a graph to illustrate it. So here we have our equilibrium price and quantity. Price is P0, quantity is Q0. Then government decides, okay, we're going to impose a maximum price. So you'll see the maximum price is imposed. So PM, which will be below equilibrium. So the bread price, as an example, it's 20 Rand. We're going to make it 10, or the government's going to make it 10, so it's going to be below equilibrium. Okay, so we can see a couple of things. First of all, we can see that as a result of lower prices, a lot more people will want to buy the good. Okay, so demand is much bigger than in equilibrium, at equilibrium. So we have Q2 and Q1, it's quite a distance from one another. But secondly, at a lower price, the suppliers say, okay, but whoa, you know what, at this low price we will not produce bread at this price. So what do we see? What we see, a difference between supply and demand, and the difference will then be the difference between Q1 and Q2, and that will be a shortage within the market. Okay, so a lot more people want to buy 10 Rand, whereas a lot less is actually produced or provided at 10 Rand. Okay, so the opposite is also true. So when we impose a minimum price, which will be above equilibrium, we will see that the quantity demanded, it's much lower than what the quantity is supplied at that price. Why? Well, consumers decide at a higher price, we are not willing to ask the same quantity. It's too expensive, so a lot of consumers move out of the market. However, at a higher price, the number of suppliers move into the market also. Well, we are now willing to provide at this price as suppliers increase their productivity, or not productivity, but increase their production at higher prices. Okay, so this is typical of a minimum and maximum prices imposed by government. So both of these examples you need to understand and explain and be able to draw how does it look on a graph. Next we continue with the analysis of what the government policy implication will be on the economy. Okay, so we call this the welfare cost. The welfare cost on the economy as a result of government intervention in maximum or through maximum prices and minimum prices. Okay, so when we do that, we look at two things. We look at consumer and producer surplus. So let's just recap on what is consumer and producer surplus. So here's a pink triangle. The pink triangle is indicative of the consumer surplus. So everything above equilibrium price and to the left of the demand curve is the consumer surplus. So this whole area here is consumer surplus. And in the green triangle, everything below the price and to the left of the supply curve shows the producer surplus. So this whole area here would then be the producer surplus. So you can see at equilibrium price and quantity, we have consumer surplus and we have producer surplus. That's before we have any intervention from government. So resources are allocated in such a way that we have equilibrium price and quantity, so it's allocated efficiently. With the implementation of a government policy, and in this example a maximum price, we then actually change the allocation, the efficiency of resources within the economy. So we introduce a maximum price, and the price that is introduced is lower than equilibrium, it's at PM. So at a lower price, the quantity supplied is reduced. So now within the market only QM is produced, which means that it's a shift from Q1 to QM. This means that this whole triangle here, which is a part of the consumer surplus and a part of the producer surplus, is now lost as a result of the reduced quantity. But we also say that in order to evaluate the welfare on the economy, everything above the equilibrium price and to the left of the demand curve is part of consumer surplus. So the consumer surplus changes. So it now includes the section B, but it continues up until R, because that section there, that A and C, is now lost in the economy as a result of reduced quantity. So it's a reduction in producer surplus and an increase in consumer surplus, but then we lose section A that was part of the consumer surplus initially, because that quantity is now reduced or excluded, and we also lose section C as a result of the lower quantity and the lower price, and that was initially part of the producer surplus. So how do we evaluate that? So we say, well, the consumers, they lose the change in A. So they lose A, but they gain B. Okay, so they gain B. Producers, on the other hand, they lose B, that's section B, and they also lose this section C here as a result of the lower quantities that's now being produced. So when one have a look at it and you evaluate it, you can see, but section B is just transferred from the producer to the consumer, so that cancel each other out. And within the economy we have this section here, A and C, which is totally lost within the economy, and that we call deadweight loss. Deadweight loss. Okay, so that's a loss, that's the welfare loss within the economy. A and C, A was part initially of consumer surplus, and C was part of producer surplus. Both of them is now lost. Section B was just transferred from the producer to the consumer. So in essence, it doesn't really matter. It's still benefit within the economy. So the only negative impact will be A and C, and that is what we call a deadweight loss. So when we look at a minimum price, it's more or less the same, but in this case the price of the policy is now above equilibrium, which means that the only difference is that the portion A that was now previously part of consumer surplus at the bottom is now part of the producer surplus. Okay, but let's go in detail through it. So our consumer surplus is everything above equilibrium and to the left of the demand curve, and our consumer surplus is, our producer surplus is everything to the bottom or below equilibrium and to the left of the supply curve. Okay, so we impose a minimum price which is above equilibrium. So that means with a new equilibrium or a new price, our consumer surplus has decreased and it's now this purple triangle. However, our producer surplus has increased. It has now increased by that portion A as a result of a shift or a higher price. But the higher price has resulted in lower demands, quantity demanded from the consumer. So we then have lower quantity from Q1 to QM. That means we lose this triangle here, which is represented by B and C. So initially, B was part of consumer surplus and C was part of the producer surplus. So both of them is now lost. So how do we evaluate it? Consumer surplus, consumers lose this part A. However, the consumers gain it because of the higher price. So it's just transferred from the consumer to the producer, but then B is lost from the consumers and C is lost from the producers, and that is then our welfare cost as a result of this policy. And it's again, we call that a deadweight loss, and it's represented by B and C. Okay, so that's it. That's how we evaluate government intervention and government policies within the economy. I hope that this recording did assist you somewhat in understanding it, and how do we evaluate it. So remember, it's just these two policies that we are looking at, and if we ask you in exams or in tests how to evaluate or the effect on the welfare of the economy as a result of these policies, we use consumer and producer surplus to evaluate the impact on the economy itself.